The autumn of 1903 came hard to Dark County, Ohio, stripping the maples early and driving the first cold down from the lake country with a meanness that felt personal. And Annie Oakley had seen 43 autumns in her life and knew well enough that the land did not care about the people on it. She stood on the porch of her house on Versailles Road that October morning and watched the tree line go gray at the edges, the way it did when the season had made up its mind, and she thought about what she owed and what she was worth, and how those two numbers had never been the same. She was 5 feet tall, and slight enough that a stranger might look past her in a crowd, and strangers often did, which had always suited her. The newspapers had printed her picture 10,000 times in the last 20 years, her name in block letters above it, Miss Annie Oakley, the little sure shot, but photographs did not catch the quality of her eyes, which were gray and precise, and missed very little. She had spent her life being underestimated. She had turned it into a profession. The crisis that would define the winter of 1903 had not announced itself yet on that October morning. It was still a thing gathering in lawyers' offices in Chicago and Cincinnati, a thing moving through the machinery of slander and print, the way a sickness moves through a town, before anyone thinks to name it. Annie Oakley did not know it was coming. She was simply standing on her porch, watching the cold come down from the north, knowing in the way a person knows weather that something was about to cost her everything she had worked for. She had survived poverty, and a poorhouse, and a county farm, and a stepfather who should not have been trusted with children. She had survived the rifle ranges of southern Ohio, and the skepticism of promoters who had never seen a woman shoot like that before. She had survived 20 years of sawdust and canvas and travel, of cities and crowds and men who wanted to own the thing they admired. She would have to decide now whether she could survive something she had not been trained for, a lie told in 250 newspapers at once. John Wayne was in Dark County that autumn because of horses. He had come down from his spread near Winterset, Iowa, not for the shooting competitions or the county fair, both of which had concluded in September, but because a man named Elroy Hatch had a bloodline of quarter horses out of a ranch near Greenville that Wayne had been watching for 2 years, and the price had finally come to something reasonable. He arrived in Greenville on the 8th of October, with a trailer and a check, and no particular interest in the local newspapers. He was 31 years old, and built like something the country had made on purpose. Broad across the shoulder, easy in his movements, a man who took up space in a room without trying. He conducted his horse business in 2 days, and saw no reason to leave immediately. The weather was holding. The country was good. He found a room at the Greenville Hotel, and ate his meals at a counter on Main Street, and listened to the town, the way he always did in a new place, without making it obvious that he was listening. He heard the name Annie Oakley on the second morning at breakfast. The man 2 stools down was reading the Cincinnati Enquirer and shaking his head, and the man beside him asked what it was. And the first man said her name and read a paragraph aloud, and the counter went quiet. Wayne did not react. He poured cream into his coffee and listened. He heard enough to understand the outline. He would hear more before he moved. Annie Oakley had been born Phoebe Ann Mosey on the 13th of August, 1860, in a log farmhouse in Patterson Township, Dark County, Ohio, and the county had given her very little and taken a great deal. Her father, Jacob Mosey, had died of exposure in the winter of 1866, after a trip to the mill in a blizzard, and after that, the family, her mother Susan, Annie, and 5 siblings, had entered the particular kind of poverty that has no floor. The farmhouse could not sustain them. Susan Mosey took in boarders, and eventually remarried, and the man she married, Daniel Brumbaugh, died before long. And after that came the county infirmary, the poorhouse, and the family that took Annie in and turned her into a servant, and worse, people she would later call only the wolves, because some shames you do not give proper names to. She had begun shooting at 8 years old. This is the part of the story that sounds invented, that sounds like the kind of detail a press agent adds to make the legend rounder, but it is documented fact. A child of 8, hunting squirrel and quail in the forests around Dark County, with a father's rifle, shooting with a precision that had no explanation beyond itself. She had sold game to a shopkeeper named G. Anthony Katzenberger in Greenville, and Katzenberger paid fair prices, and Annie had sent money home to her mother, and by the time she was 15, she had paid off the family mortgage. The exact amount was $150. through hunting alone. You can look this up. The Darke County records carry her name in several places, and in none of them is there anything that looks like luck. She had beaten Frank Butler in a shooting match in Cincinnati in 1881. Butler was a professional marksman, touring with a stage act, and he had accepted a challenge match against an unnamed local shooter without knowing the shooter was 21 years old and female. He hit 24 of 25 targets. She hit 25 of 25. He was not a man who had trouble with being beaten. He proposed to her instead, and they were married the following year, and for the rest of their lives, Frank Butler would say that she was the better shot and mean it, and he understood that being the manager of the greatest exhibition shooter in the world was a more interesting life than being a good marksman himself. She joined Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show in 1885, after a brief time with another outfit, and within one season, she was the headline. Sitting Bull, who traveled with the show that year and watched her shoot every night, gave her the name Watanya Cecilia, Little Sure Shot, and the name followed her for the rest of her career. She performed before Queen Victoria and Kaiser Wilhelm and the Prince of Wales, and the crowned heads of Europe, and every combination of American audience that existed, from working men in canvas seats to the president in a box, and she hit her targets in all those places with the same unhurried precision, and she never played the crowd for sympathy or the trick of the gender, just let the shooting speak for itself. Reviewers wrote about her composure. They wrote about the particular quality of her stillness before the shot, as though she were not deciding to shoot at all, merely noticing that the target was there and the bullet might as well go. By 1901, she had been with the Wild West show for 16 years. She was 40 years old and still hitting a playing card edge-on at 30 paces, still splitting a dime tossed into the air, still asking for the toughest shot and getting it right. In October of that year, a train carrying the Wild West show derailed near Lexington, North Carolina, and Annie was badly hurt, her spine compressed, her left side damaged, the particular kind of injury that does not show plainly from the outside. She underwent 5 operations over the next year. Some accounts said she had been partially paralyzed and recovered fully. She would not confirm or deny this, because confirming invited pity and denying invited disbelief. What she said was that she was well, and she shot to prove it. She had retired from the Wild West show after the accident and moved back to Ohio with Frank, and they had settled into a quieter life in Darke County. Not a wealthy life, because the show money had gone into medical bills and travel and living, as they had always lived, but a stable one. They owned their home. They had modest savings. Frank managed some bookings for her, small exhibition shoots, and she gave marksmanship lessons and talked with promoters about returning to performance. It was not the life she had lived under the canvas, but it was a life with her name on it, and that had always been the important thing. Then September 1903 arrived, and with it a wire dispatch that ran in over 250 American newspapers. The story said that Annie Oakley had been arrested in Chicago for stealing the trousers of a black man in order to get money for cocaine. It said she was destitute, depraved, and broken, a fallen woman, the shell of a famous name. It gave her age and described her physical appearance, and placed her at a specific address on the south side of Chicago, where the arrest had allegedly occurred. It was specific enough that readers believed it, specific enough that editors ran it without checking, specific enough that by the time anyone thought to ask whether it was true, the wire had already circled the country. It was not Annie Oakley. It was a woman in Chicago who had used her name. Some accounts said deliberately. Some said it was a case of mistaken identity between a drunk woman and an officer who recognized a famous name and wrote it down without thinking. The actual Annie Oakley was in Darke County, Ohio, in her own house, when the story broke, and she had not been to Chicago in months. She had never been arrested. She did not use cocaine or steal from anyone. The story was false in every particular. But it had run in 250 newspapers. And newspaper editors in 1903, when it came to correcting a story about a woman of dubious morality, allegedly arrested for theft and drug use, were not in the habit of speed. The mechanism of the slander was not complicated, which was part of what made it so difficult to undo. The wire services of that era operated on speed and volume. A story was filed from one bureau and sent down the wire to subscribing papers, and the papers printed what came over the wire because the wire was the authority, and there was no time, in the daily machinery of print, to verify every dispatch before the press ran. The Chicago bureau that had filed the story had taken the police report at face value. The police report had been made in error, or in carelessness, or in some combination of the two, and by the time the error was identified, the Wire had already done its work. Annie had read the story in the Greenville paper on a Tuesday morning in late September. Frank had brought it in from the porch with the rest of the mail and set it on the kitchen table without saying anything because he did not know yet what it said, and she had read it standing up, with her coffee going cold beside her, and when she finished, she set the paper down flat on the table with the care of a person deciding not to throw it. She contacted her attorney, William Phelps, in Dayton that same day. Phelps was a competent man, and a careful one, and when he had read the clip she sent him by post, and the 6 others she gathered in the following week, he was honest with her about what the work would require. Suing 250 newspapers for libel was not an impossible legal theory. It was, however, an enormous practical undertaking. Each case would have to be filed separately, in the jurisdiction where the paper operated. Each paper would have to be served. Each would mount its own defense. Some would settle quickly, and some would fight, and some would drag the proceedings out for years. The cost in filing fees alone, before legal fees, before travel, before the deposition work that would need to happen in a dozen cities, was beyond anything she could reasonably estimate. Phelps gave her a floor. She would need at minimum $2,000 to begin, and that was a conservative number that assumed early settlements and no serious opposition from the major papers. Annie Oakley, in October of 1903, had $800 in savings. She had her house, the value of which Phelps estimated at perhaps $600. She had her rifles, and her medals, and her reputation, the last of which was precisely what was under attack. She had Frank, who was steady and calm, and offered to write to some of the show promoters he knew about potential bookings. But the truth, that neither of them said aloud, was that you could not book exhibition appearances for a woman the public had just read was a cocaine-addicted thief in Chicago. Not yet. Not until the papers were corrected, and the papers would not be corrected until someone forced the correction, and forcing the correction required the lawsuit, and the lawsuit required money she did not have. She had gone to the Greenville Savings Institution on the 21st of October. The institution was managed by a man named Harold Fenwick, who had known her name since she was a girl hunting squirrel in the county forests, and had attended 3 Wild West show performances over the years, and had, as far as Annie could tell, genuine respect for her. Fenwick listened to her request with courtesy and attention. He asked his questions carefully. Then he explained, with the same courtesy, that the institution could not extend a loan of $1,200, the difference between her savings and what Phelps had quoted her, without security, and that her home was the only asset available as security, and that the outstanding value of the home was not sufficient to collateralize a loan of that size, and that there was, as he put it, the additional complexity of the recent news. The additional complexity of the recent news. She had thanked him and left. She had gone to a second institution, the Darke County Farmers Loan Office, which was not a bank in the formal sense, but had served the agricultural community of the county for 30 years. The loan officer there, a man named Chet Willard, did not know her personally, but knew her name from the papers. He made a point of mentioning this, the papers, as though her presence in them were a credential she might want to distance herself from. He was not unkind. He was simply part of the mechanism, the way Fenwick was part of the mechanism, the way the wire service was part of the mechanism, each element operating according to its own rules, each rule perfectly reasonable in isolation, each one combining with the others to produce a situation that no single person had intended, and no single person could undo. Willard's answer was also no. The loan was too large, the security insufficient, and there was, he did not say but clearly meant, the matter of the recent news. The man who had built his own steak out of something raw and hard and largely made by hand came into the story on the morning of October the 23rd, and he came into it the way John Wayne came into most situations, without fanfare, without announcement, as if he had simply decided that this was where he needed to be, and had walked there directly. He had arrived in Darke County for the horses. He had stayed because the weather was fine, and the room at the Greenville Hotel was clean, and the breakfast counter on Main Street served good coffee, and because something in the talk of the town had snagged his attention. He had heard the name Annie Oakley in several conversations by then, heard it with the particular mix of discomfort and pity, and half-belief that a community wears when one of its own has been publicly shamed. And he had asked enough questions in a quiet way, of the hotel clerk, of the man at the feed store on the north end of Main Street, of the counterwoman who poured his coffee, to understand that the shame was borrowed, and the reputation was sound, and the woman herself was in the county right now, in her house on Versailles Road, trying to find the money to fight back. He had ridden out 2 days before he did anything. He was not a man who acted on first knowledge. He rode past the house on Versailles Road in the late afternoon of October the 21st, and saw a house that was well kept and modest, painted white, a porch running along the front, the garden put to bed for winter, with the care of someone who intended to use it again in spring. He saw a small woman on the porch with her back to the road, and did not stop. He rode back the next morning, and saw the same house, quiet in the early cold, no movement yet. He stopped at the feed store again, and talked with the owner, a man named Bert Caldwell, who had lived in Greenville all his life, and knew the Oakley history from the hunting years forward. Caldwell did not editorialize. He gave Wayne the facts as he understood them, the wire story, the timeline, the meeting with Phelps, the 2 loan refusals, the amount that was still needed. He mentioned, without being asked, that Frank Butler had taken the train to Dayton that morning, to meet again with Phelps, and see if there was a cheaper approach to the first filing. Caldwell said all of this in the way a man discusses weather or crop prices, as fact, without drama. Then he went back to his inventory, and let Wayne stand there with the information. Wayne stood there for a moment. He looked at nothing in particular on the wall behind Caldwell's counter. Then he asked the single practical question, what was the number? Caldwell told him what he knew. Phelps had quoted a floor of $2,000 for starting the full campaign. Annie had $800. The gap was $1,200, unless the first few filings could be done more cheaply, which Phelps thought unlikely for the larger papers that would resist settlement. Wayne nodded. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he thanked Caldwell and walked out of the feed store into the October morning. He drove back to the Greenville Hotel. In his room he opened the saddlebag he had brought up to the room, which he always kept there because he did not leave anything valuable in a locked vehicle or an unattended space, and he counted what was inside. The purchase of Hatch's horses had been $1,250, negotiated down from $1,500, paid by check. He had brought cash for expenses and emergencies. He had been in Darke County for 2 weeks. He counted what remained, $1,040 in bills, varied denominations, folded into a bank envelope he had gotten in Greenville. He counted it twice. He set it on the bed. There was also a check in the saddlebag from a land payment that had come in before he left Iowa, a tenant farmer named Del Spears, who rented grazing acreage on the north end of Wayne's spread, and had sent a draft for 1 season's rent. The check was drawn on the First National Bank of Winterset, and made out to Wayne for $260. He could not cash it locally with certainty, but the banknote was solid. He had cashed checks at the Greenville Savings Institution twice since his arrival. He picked up the check and looked at it. He put the cash in his breast pocket and the check in his shirt pocket, and put his hat on, and walked back out into the morning. He did not go directly to the house on Versailles Road. He went first to the Greenville Savings Institution and spoke to a teller about the check, a young man named Roy Carpenter, who had handled his previous transactions. Carpenter took the check and went to the back office and came out with Harold Fenwick, who looked at the check and at Wayne and asked a few straightforward questions, and then approved the cash exchange, $260 in bills. Fenwick asked if he needed an envelope, and Wayne said yes. He counted it all in the lobby, $1,040 plus $260, $1,300 exactly. He put it in the envelope and put the envelope in his breast pocket. He walked to where his truck was parked on Main Street and drove out Versailles Road. The house was quiet when he turned into the drive. The garden was as he had seen it from the road, put to bed with care, the beds edged, the dormant rose canes tied up against the fence, in the way that a person does it when they mean to see the roses again in June. A gray cat was sitting on the porch railing and watching his approach with the particular indifference of a cat that has seen people come and go. He stopped the truck and got out, and walked to the porch and knocked. Annie Oakley opened the door before the second knock, And she had heard the truck on the gravel drive. She always heard things before they expected to be heard. And she had come to the door directly, rather than waiting. She looked at him without recognition. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, wearing a good coat, his hat in his hands, and he had the bearing of someone who was there on purpose. She said she did not know him, and he said his name, John Wayne, out of Winterset, Iowa, and she studied him for a moment. She had heard the name in a general way, the way anyone in the western-facing part of the country might have heard it. A rancher with a reputation, a man people spoke of as straight-dealing. She did not know him personally. He did not waste time on pleasantries. He told her he had been in Greenville on horse business, and had heard about the situation with the newspapers, and had heard specifically about the legal costs and the loan offices. He told her he wanted to help with the gap. He told her the amount he had. $1,300. He said it plain. She looked at him for a long moment. The gray cat on the porch railing watched both of them. She said she did not take charity. He said this was not charity. This was a loan, if she preferred it that way, at no interest, payable whenever the lawsuit settled, which he understood would be some years. He did not need the money before he had it. She said she would need to speak to Frank. He said Frank was in Dayton with her attorney. He had heard that from Bert Caldwell at the feed store. He said this without embarrassment, not pretending he had not already gathered the details. She looked at him again. The morning was cold, the gray kind of cold that Dark County gets in late October, when the clouds flatten out against the sky, and the light seems to come from everywhere and nowhere. She said, quietly, that she was going to ask him in and make coffee, and that he should not take that as an answer either way. He came inside. The kitchen was warm from the stove and orderly. The table was clean wood, the chairs straight. There were a few framed photographs on the wall. He could see them from the kitchen doorway. Show posters and formal photographs, and one image that was clearly European, a large crowd, a banner. He did not look at them too long. She made coffee without ceremony, her movements precise and economical, and set 2 cups on the table and sat across from him. He set the envelope on the table between them. He did not push it toward her. He let it sit there. She looked at it. She said she had done the arithmetic on the campaign at least 30 times in the past 3 weeks, and had not found a way to bring the floor number lower than William Phelps had quoted it. She said she had spoken to 2 other attorneys, one in Dayton and one in Columbus, and both had confirmed Phelps's estimate within a margin of $200. She said she was not in the habit of accepting that a thing could not be done, but she was also in the habit of accepting arithmetic. He said that $1,300 plus her $800 was $2,100. That was above Phelps's floor. She said yes. He said then there was room to begin. She looked at the envelope again. She was quiet for a moment, and it was not the silence of uncertainty. She had made her decision sometime in the previous 30 seconds. He could see that. But the silence of a person, choosing how to accept a difficult thing with dignity. She said she would require a paper, something in writing, terms of the loan, his address in Iowa, her signature, and his. He said that was exactly right. She got up and went to a desk in the front room, and came back with paper and a pen, and she wrote the terms herself. The amount, $1,300, to be repaid from settlement proceeds of the ongoing newspaper libel actions. At no interest, at no specified date, and she wrote his name and address as he gave them, and she signed it, and passed it to him, and he read it, and signed it, and she put her copy in the drawer of the kitchen desk. He picked up the envelope and held it out, and she took it. She said thank you, and she said it the way a person says something they mean fully and intend not to repeat, because repeating it would make it smaller. He said nothing. He picked up his hat from the chair beside him. She walked him to the door, and he went down the porch steps and got in his truck and drove back toward Greenville. She stood on the porch and watched him go. The gray cat came and sat beside her feet. The cold came down through the maple trees at the edge of the property, and the leaves that were left rattled against each other in the first edge of the morning wind, and she stood there for a while, with the envelope in her hand, not going inside yet. It was a little before 9 in the morning. She would stand on that porch until the sound of his truck had been gone for several minutes, and then she would go inside and put the envelope in the kitchen desk with the signed paper and start breakfast, because Frank would be home from Dayton by evening, and they would need to telephone Phelps in the morning, and there was a great deal of work ahead. But for the moment, she stood on the porch in the cold, and breathed the October air, and looked at the tree line going gray, and whatever she felt, relief, or the particular weight of being helped by a stranger, or the beginning of something that felt like momentum after 3 weeks of walls, she kept it to herself, as she kept most things. The porch boards were cold under her feet. The morning was going to be clear and bitter. Somewhere north of the property, a crow was complaining about something in the bare trees. She was still standing there when the eastern light came up enough to throw shadows, and the cold deepened, and the day began. Frank Butler came home on the evening train from Dayton, and found her at the kitchen table, with the lamp lit, and 2 cups already poured. She told him what had happened, the visitor, the name, the envelope, the paper signed. And Frank listened without interrupting, which was one of his best qualities, and when she was finished, he picked up his cup and held it and said, simply, "Was the paper sound?" She said yes. He said then, "It was good," and meant it. Frank drove her to Dayton 2 days later to meet with Phelps, and Phelps received the $2,100, Annie's $800 and Wayne's $1,300, counted and receipted, with the careful satisfaction of a lawyer who can now do the work he has been telling his client needs to be done. He filed the first action before the end of October. He filed it against the newspaper that had run the most prominent version of the Wire story, the Chicago Evening Journal, because that paper had the largest circulation, and therefore the greatest reach, and because its editor had, in Phelps's view, the clearest obligation to have checked before printing. The filing made its own small news in the legal community, and in the press. An attorney named Mershon handled the journal's initial defense, and took a position that the paper had acted in good faith on wire information, which was the standard defense, and which Phelps had anticipated entirely. The negotiation took 3 months. The journal settled in January of 1904 for $1,000. Annie was present for the settlement conference and did not speak during the legal exchange, but when the editor, a man named Dunning, offered his personal apology, she accepted it briefly and did not embellish. The settlements came in over the next several years. It was slow work, the kind of work that runs in the background of a life, while the life itself continues. By 1906, Annie and Frank were back in exhibition shooting. She had given herself time to fully heal from the train accident's lingering effects, had rebuilt her strength over the winter of 1903 and the spring of 1904, with the same methodical stubbornness she had applied to everything since childhood. And when she stood on a shooting range again in the spring of 1904, before a small invited audience in Greenville, she shot 25 clay pigeons without a miss, and walked off the range without any particular expression on her face. The newspapers that had run the false story ran corrections eventually. Some ran them before settlement, as part of the negotiation. Some ran them after, as conditions of it. A few ran corrections that were smaller than the original story, and less prominently placed, which was not a surprise. The corrections, where they appeared, used words like regrettable and unfounded, and error in wire transmission. None of them were entirely adequate. Annie did not expect them to be. She had not started the lawsuits because she expected satisfaction from editors. She had started them because letting a lie stand in 250 papers unchallenged was a different kind of poverty than the one she had spent her childhood in, and she had survived the first kind by refusing to accept it, and she intended to survive this kind the same way. She won 54 of the 54 actions she brought to completion. The settlements ranged from small, a rural paper in Tennessee settled for $60 and a printed retraction, to substantial. The combined total of settlements over the period between 1903 and 1910 was approximately $45,000, which is a figure that several contemporary legal historians have cited as one of the most successful newspaper libel campaigns in American legal history to that point. She paid John Wayne back in the spring of 1904, after the journal settlement cleared. The amount was $1,300, the exact figure from the paper she had written, and he had signed on her kitchen table. She sent a bank draft to his address in Winterset, Iowa, with a brief note. The note said paid in full, as agreed. Your confidence in the arithmetic was well placed. She signed it with her given name, Phoebe Ann Butler, which was the name she used on legal documents, not the stage name, because the document was a personal one, and she made distinctions. Frank asked her later whether she thought they would hear from him again, and she said probably not, and she said it without any particular feeling about it, because that was also the kind of man he was, the kind that does a thing because it is the right thing and does not require correspondence afterward. She was right. The bank draft was cashed. No reply came. The paper in the kitchen desk, her copy of the loan agreement, signed by both of them, remained there for the rest of the time they lived in that house. In the near years, by 1905 and 1906, the life on Versailles Road had a quality to it that the years of canvas and sawdust and train schedules had not. It was quieter and smaller, and entirely hers. Frank kept up the garden that spring, in a way that suggested he had plans for it, beyond the current season. Annie took students in marksmanship, young women, mostly, and some young men who came from the surrounding county, and she taught them with the patience that comes from knowing exactly how a skill is built, step by step, without shortcuts. She charged fair fees and expected serious attention, and got both. The exhibition bookings resumed gradually, carefully selected. She was not performing under the old pressures of the Wild West show calendar. 8 months on the road, 7 performances a week, but in smaller venues, at events that had meaning to her, for audiences she chose to stand before. She shot in competition at several regional matches in 1905 and 1906, and won most of them, and was second in 2, and did not seem troubled by the 2. The precision she brought to the range was the same it had always been. The settlements coming in from the newspaper suits meant that the financial pressure that had defined the winter of 1903 was slowly easing, and the easing of it showed in the way she moved through the house. Not lighter exactly, but less occupied by the arithmetic that had sat behind her eyes every waking hour of that autumn. In September of 1905, she drove out to Bert Caldwell's feed store on the north end of Main Street, and asked Caldwell, as a matter of record, what he had told the man from Iowa about her situation. Caldwell, who was not a man given to discomfort, told her plainly what he had said: the amounts, the loan refusals, the schedule. He said he had not told him anything he had not already known, or could not find out from other people in town. She nodded. She bought a 50-pound bag of feed for the 2 chickens Frank had recently decided they needed, and she carried it to her truck herself, before Caldwell could come around the counter to help, because she always carried her own things, and drove back to Versailles Road. By 1907, the exhibition work had taken her and Frank back into a broader circuit. She performed in Pinehurst, North Carolina, that winter and into 1908, giving marksmanship lessons and exhibitions at the resort there, and she became a fixture of the Pinehurst social world, without particularly trying, because she was who she was, and people sought her out, and she was gracious to most of them, and direct with all of them, and continued to be entirely herself, regardless of the company. She met Theodore Roosevelt at a Washington event in 1907, and found him lively and frank, and not as intimidating as his reputation suggested, which she did not say aloud, because she was courteous. She could hit a dime tossed in the air at 40 paces, and she did not need Roosevelt's approval to know it. The house on Versailles Road remained theirs. They returned to it regularly, between engagements, and in the off-seasons, and it kept the quality it had developed in that first post-crisis year. A place with a garden that someone intended to use next spring, a kitchen with a clean table, a front room with the show photographs on the wall, and the desk in the corner where certain papers were kept. One of those papers was a single sheet of plain paper, folded twice, in the bottom of the kitchen desk drawer. It documented a loan of $1,300 made in October of 1903, between one John Wayne of Winterset, Iowa, and one Annie Oakley of Versailles Road, Greenville, Darke County, Ohio. The terms were in her handwriting. Both signatures were there, across the bottom, in her hand, in a different ink that indicated it had been added later. Repaid in full, April 1904. She did not throw it away. By the autumn of 1908, when the exhibition life had fully resumed, and the newspaper settlements were nearly all concluded, the story of October 1903 had settled into the category of things that had been survived and were not regularly revisited. She did not speak of it publicly. It was not the kind of story she told, the kind where she had needed help, and someone had provided it. She was comfortable with the story she had made of herself. The girl from Darke County, who had fed her family with a rifle, and then become the best exhibition shooter the world had seen, and had fought back against a machine that tried to flatten her with a lie. And that story did not require the $1,300 to be visible in it. The $1,300 was in the receipts, and in the desk drawer, and in the settlement records of 54 lawsuits filed in multiple jurisdictions. It was part of what had happened. It did not need to be the part she told. Frank knew the full account. Her attorney Phelps knew the financial piece. Bert Caldwell in Greenville knew what he had told the man from Iowa, and had presumably drawn his own conclusions about what followed. But Caldwell was not a man who talked about other people's business without cause. John Wayne himself was not a man who talked about it, because he had driven back to Greenville on the morning of October the 23rd, finished his remaining business in the county, and driven home to Iowa without mentioning it to anyone. The horse purchase was what he had come for. The horses were in the trailer. He went home. The ripple that spread from that morning was not the visible kind, not the kind that makes it into speeches or ceremonies. It spread in the specific form of a libel campaign that changed how American newspapers handled wire service errors. Not immediately, not as a formal policy change, but as a professional memory. The Oakley suits were cited in journalism schools. They were cited in press association discussions about verification standards. A lecturer at the Ohio State journalism program mentioned them in 1911. Not by the name of the lawsuit, but by the pattern. 54 papers, 54 defeats, one woman who had the money to pursue the matter all the way. He did not mention where the money had come from. He may not have known. The student in that lecture who heard the number 54 and wrote it in his notebook was a young man from Darke County named Gerald Watkins, whose mother had attended Annie Oakley's marksmanship classes in 1905 and had kept a photograph from that day on the wall of the farmhouse kitchen. Watkins went on to become an editor at the Columbus Dispatch and carried with him, in the long way that such things carry, the knowledge that the machinery of print could be made to account for itself if someone had the resources and the will to require it. He required it, in smaller ways, over the course of a career. He did not connect this practice to Annie Oakley directly. It was simply part of what he understood about the job. The decades after 1903 took the shape they were going to take. Annie and Frank traveled and worked and returned to Ohio in the seasons when returning made sense. And she shot and taught and was herself. And the legend of the little sure shot continued to accrue in the way legends do, around people who are still alive to clarify them, but rarely bother. She was injured in a car accident in 1922 and spent time in recovery and still managed to shoot at exhibitions into 1925, in the way she had always managed the recovery periods, by treating them as preparatory, as the stage before the thing that came next. She died in Greenville, Ohio, on the 3rd of November, 1926. Frank Butler died 18 days later. The accounts vary on what exactly he died of. The official cause was one thing, but the people who knew them said he simply could not sustain the gap she left, and that seems as accurate a cause of death as any official record. The house on Versailles Road passed through several hands in the decades after her death. It was lived in by families who knew what it had been, mostly, and treated it accordingly. By the 1950s, it had the status of a local landmark without quite being protected as one, which is a precarious kind of status, and there were years when it was not well maintained, and years when someone took it in hand again and put work into it. In the summer of 1961, the Darke County Historical Society formally documented the house as part of a larger effort to record the county's significant sites. A woman named Margaret Heston, who directed the society's documentation project, went through the contents of the house in the company of the then owner, a man named Floyd Bates, whose family had purchased the property in 1941. In the kitchen desk, the same desk, still in the corner of the front room, Heston found a folded paper in the bottom drawer. It was a loan document dated October 23, 1903. It listed an amount of $1,300. It had two signatures. One was Annie Oakley's. The other was John Wayne's. Across the bottom, in the same handwriting as the body of the document, it said, "Repaid in full, April 1904. Heston photographed the document and made a transcript and placed both in the society's archive. She wrote a brief note in her documentation log. Unknown circumstances of loan. Both parties deceased. Document appears authentic. Signatures consistent with known exemplars for both principals. Provenance. Kitchen desk. Original house location." The document itself, the original, went into a flat archival box in the County Historical Society's storage room on 4th Street in Greenville. Filed under Oakley, Phoebe Ann, Annie Oakley. Personal papers, miscellaneous. It is still there. The box also contains a receipt from William Phelps, dated November of 1903, acknowledging the initial retainer for the newspaper libel campaign, a letter from a shooting club in Germany, dated 1893, and a photograph of a woman standing at a porch railing with a gray cat at her feet, taken in autumn, the maple trees at the edge of the property stripped down to their bare lines behind her. She is not looking at the camera, she is looking at the tree line. John Wayne's name appears in the Historical Society's records only once, in that documentation log entry written by Margaret Heston in 1961. He had died 2 years before Heston wrote the entry, in June of 1979. No, the calendar is what it is. He died in 1979, and Heston's entry predates that, which means his name in the county record was recorded while he was still alive. He never knew it was there. There is no indication he ever returned to Darke County after October of 1903. The horses he purchased from Elroy Hatch's bloodline were, by the accounts of people who knew the Winterset spread in those years, among the best stock on the property, sound and quick, and not given to any particular trouble. The archive box on 4th Street in Greenville sits in a room that is climate-controlled now, in a way it was not in 1961, and the paper inside it is in better condition than it has a right to be, given its age. The 2 signatures are clear. The handwriting of the loan terms is careful and precise, the kind of handwriting you learn when you did not always have paper to practice on, and treated every sheet as something to be used exactly right. 54 newspapers corrected a lie because a woman from Darke County had the money to require it. She had the money because a man from Iowa counted what was in his saddlebag on the morning of October the 23rd, 1903, and found it was enough, and drove out Versailles Road without announcing himself, and set an envelope on a kitchen table, and went home. The gray cat was not in the photograph by design. It was just there, on the railing, the morning someone took the picture. But it is in the frame, at the edge of the image, looking in a different direction from the woman, the way cats do, as though the significant thing is somewhere off to the side, somewhere neither the camera nor the woman is looking, in the bare trees at the edge of the property, where the cold comes down from the north in October, and the leaves that are left rattle against each other in the first light, and the day has not yet decided what kind of day it will be.